On a stroll westward down Main Street in Batesville, Arkansas, we pass a number of older business buildings, some of which have been preserved from times now distant in most memories. We're returning to the place where the town first began. In the settlement's earliest years, around 1812, a few traders built cabins on what was then called Poke Bayou. As more tradesmen and families arrived, most by boat up the White River, the tiny settlement grew large enough to be platted in 1821 and named Batesville. Batesville's earliest public square, with the county courthouse and jail, were located where an empty lot now stands. The Independence County Jail has recently been relocated in a new building near the original jail site. In the frontier village of Batesville, Delaware, Shawnee, and Cherokee wandered down the main street to trade their furs with early businessmen. Bobby Bates had built a tavern inn on Lower Main Street, and John Ringgold and his wife Elizabeth not only constructed his store, but also their fine brick home across the street from Bates's Tavern. Now, when the Ringgold house was torn down in 1964, some of its bricks were reused in the present Chamber of Commerce building. Today, Marshall's Dry Goods stands on the Ringgold site. In the next years, business buildings continued to spread up the hill, eastward on Main Street, away from the steamboat landing on the bayou, and away from the floodplain. By 1850, some solid structures rose in the place of temporary frame business buildings. The Batesville Institute, with its town hall, Masonic Hall, and Oddfellows Hall, was dedicated with much pride and ceremony in 1858. Sadly, it burned months later in 1859. It was rebuilt again and continued its life until fire finally took it away 2 decades later. In 1880, Simon Adler constructed his opera house on the lot of where the Batesville Institute once stood. He was a Jewish banker who was so loved by farmers who came to him for loans that 11 children are known to have been named for him. His fine opera house was referred to as the Daisy of the town and bustled with theater-goers, orchestras, and dancers. Later, the building was occupied by the Yateman Gray Adams Company and then the Arkansas Dry Goods Company. Now, these names can still be seen in the peeling paint on the building's front. In more recent years, it was the Fabric Connection store and then the Pool store. Next to his opera house, Simon Adler built his bank in 1891. It still stands, now containing a bail bonding business. It remains the oldest surviving building in Batesville that once housed a bank. Just to the west of the bank, Batesville's luxurious 3-story Arlington Hotel had been constructed of stone in 1880. After it burned in 1927, it was reclaimed as a 2-story building and named the Marvin Hotel. It burned in 2003. About 1882, H.L. Minikin built a general merchandise store, a fine sandstone building with arched openings which stood across the street from the Adler Opera House. The building is now home to the Paper Chase bookstore. Next to the Minikin store, the mayor of Batesville erected a building in 1887 to be a saddle and buggy showroom. Around the turn of the century, it became a saloon, and the second floor was known as Rutherford Hall. It also held county offices, while a new courthouse was being built in 1892. Today, that building has been beautifully preserved and serves as the architectural offices of Lee and Associates. Frank Brewer built his general store across the street sometime before 1924, but it was replaced in the 1940s by the Melba Theater. The intersection of Main Street and Central Avenue was the major crossroads in downtown Batesville, with Central Avenue stretching out over the Bayou Bridge into West Batesville. At this intersection, back in 1838, on the northwest corner, the State Bank of Arkansas, later known as the Bank Exchange Hotel, was built with its massive Greek Doric-style columns. It was celebrated as one of the finest buildings in Arkansas. On its steps, slaves were sold, and in front of its columns, troops marched off to war. During the Civil War, it was requisitioned as a military hospital, but in post-war years, it became a social center. The hotel burned in 1882 on a cold December day, but out of its ashes arose the new three-storied Bank of Batesville in 1889. However, about 85 years later, its brick walls became so unstable that it had to be razed in 1975. Bricks from the bank now reside in the walls of the law office that sits on its site today. Across the intersection of Main Street and Central Avenue, the two-story Earnhardt Hotel once stood, built in 1909. In 1985, it was refurbished and opened as a restaurant, but fire destroyed it in 1988. Across Main Street, Sarah Case, widow of George Case, who built many of Batesville's early homes, had several business buildings constructed. Now, they're some of the oldest surviving places on Main Street. One of the Case buildings was a corner grocery store, inhabited by J.L. Boggs in 1894, then by W.B. Menard's Grocery, later by the Army-Navy store, and presently Good Old Days Antiques. Of special interest is the painted Coca-Cola sign on its Central Avenue side. One of Mrs. Case's other buildings housed Goodwin Drugs, which was in business by the 1880s. Now Electronics Unlimited resides there. At the upper end of the block, Theodore Maxfield built a general merchandise and cotton sales store in the early 1870s. It was located on the northwestern corner of Broad Street facing Main Street. Maxfield then built another store across Broad Street toward the east. At that time, in 1875, he was criticized by people for moving so far out of town. They said he wouldn't do a lick of business way out there, but he proved them wrong, and his business remained in the family for over a century. A grand opening was held in his store at the turn of the century. The exterior was later modernized, but the interior has retained its pressed tin ceiling. It became Back in Time Antiques in 1985. Maxfield had also expanded his second store to the corner of Broad Street in 1883 to house his dry goods. Now, that part of the building later became Crosby Drug, containing downtown's last soda fountain. In the 1990s, the building was remodeled and faced with a buff brick. Next door to the Maxfield store, S.A. Hale went into the dry goods business in 1879. By 1908, he set up shop in a building on Main Street. In 1914 and 1925, he added a second and then a third floor and bricked the front. He also had an additional store up the street, specializing in books, ledgers, and paper items. The business stayed in the family for over 100 years. Elizabeth's Restaurant and Catering is presently operating in the building. The seat of Independence County government was first contained in a log structure on the public square. But in 1858, a brick courthouse was built farther east on Main Street out of the floodplain where the present courthouse stands. By 1892, that building had become shabby and was replaced on the same site with a magnificent Victorian three-story edifice, complete with clock tower and statue of Lady Justice on the roof. In 1939, it was declared unsafe, torn down and replaced in 1940 with the present fourth courthouse designed in the Art Deco style. On the corner east of the courthouse, J.B. Fitzhugh opened his men's clothing, hat, and shoe store, started business in 1885. The front of the building was remodeled in 1947. The business remained in the family until it closed after 99 years of service. In former years, doctors, dentists, and insurance agents had offices on the second floor with an entrance from the side. Students of Batesville Ballet now practice in the building. Over the years, this block has held many significant businesses, including shoe, clothing, jewelry, and drug stores. As the 20th century neared, Batesville's business district continued to grow farther up the hill. When the Neely and Wyckoff homes on Main Street burned in 1897, the Barnett brothers obtained those lots and constructed a fine store in 1903. Barnett Brothers Mercantile Store was to become the anchor of Main Street for the next 80 years. It had a super balcony that overlooked the main floor, and the second story was devoted to many professional offices and meeting rooms. The building was remodeled several times, but finally closed in 1988. It now houses Prodentec and Four Seasons Travel Agency. Back in 1910, Main Street had taken on a well-settled look, with buggies and wagons jostling past one another. Ladies with parasols kept to the boardwalk, street lights dangled above, and prominent businesses swelled with shoppers. The basic structure of most Main Street buildings was preserved, even though businesses came and went within them. By the 1940s, the First National Bank made its home in the two-story former J.W. Evans store on the corner of 3rd Street and Main. The Citizens Bank and Trust also had done business within the building. It was completely modified in 1957 and houses Skinner's Jewelry Store. During the Great Depression, several businesses gave way to bankruptcy and closed. But given a few more years of financial recovery, many of the oldest surviving buildings took on modern fronts and thrived. On the northeast corner of 3rd and Main, after a disastrous fire in 1907 had burned most of the buildings on the block, the Rosenthal Petty Hardware was constructed. By about 1920, the Parks Hardware Company sold their goods from that building. In 1953, the new Citizens Bank began its operation there, sporting a drive-up deposit box on the side street. Today, you will find the Platter Inn and Treble Clef Music Store in that location. Long ago, in 1887, Richard Williams erected a stone building across the street from what became the Parks Hardware. By 1914, the building had become Barnett's Bargain Annex, an outlet for their larger store built across the street. Later, it became a supermarket. A fire damaged the building in 1982, but it was reclaimed, and Schwegman's Office City does business there now. On up the street, a new federal building and post office started construction in 1903 to the delight of the whole community. Often over the next years, groups posed in front of its steps for photographs to be taken. It's now the White River Regional Library with municipal offices on the second floor. In the 1930s, business spread on up past the post office. The Crouch Building, later housing Robertson's Hardware, was often the backdrop to photos taken of the White River Carnival Parade. After a fire destroyed it in 1957, it was rebuilt as a single story and now houses Pioneer General Store. At the upper end of the block, Dr. Gray's Hospital opened as the pride of the community in 1939. It served the city for several decades before closing. The building now stands ready for new owners. Today, the line between the historic commercial district and the historic residential district blurs. The oldest surviving home in Batesville, known as the Garrett House, built in 1842 and splendidly restored to its original state by its owners, sits comfortably beside one of the city's newest bank buildings. Batesville is fortunate that most of its earliest Main Street business buildings are still in use. They remind us of the city's beginnings and its 180 years of growth. Many of its buildings continue to offer places in which to shop, live, work, play, or worship in a safe, attractive, historic environment.